Hi folks, how you doing? My name is Danny and I am alcoholic. This is the third of 4 1-hour videos in which I am sharing my experience and my knowledge, offering strength and hope on the book Alcoholics Anonymous and my personal journey of recovery. In the first video I shared about the problem, step 1 essentially. In the second I talked about the solution, the power, as well as a decision to turn towards that power, essentially steps 2 and 3. During this third video, I will explore how we access the power, essentially steps 4 through to 9. So quite a lot to cover really in a short time. So I can't cover everything in this 1 hour, I'm afraid, but I'll give as much as I can. So here we go on accessing the power. Now I'll begin where I left off in the last video, the step 3 decision. We make the decision to live the spiritual way of life, for if not, we're going to die from this illness. That said, step 3 is only a decision, and a decision is meaningless unless it is followed by action. To repeat the paragraph on pages 63 to 64. Next, we launched out on a course of vigorous action, the first step of which is a personal house cleaning, which many of us had never attempted. Though our decision was a vital and crucial step, it could have little permanent effect unless at once followed by a strenuous effort to face and to be rid of the things in ourselves which have been blocking us. Our liquor was but a symptom, so we had to get down to causes and conditions. Therefore, we started upon a personal inventory. This was step 4. So we take stock of our lives here. We discover what forms, what develops, what comes from the root of our troubles, how self manifests, how this plays out in our physical lives. We look at how the spiritual malady takes shape and form in our lived reality, in our lives. Essentially, how we try to manage life and the people in our lives, how we play God in the world and then not perform our true role in life. The key to recovery is the ability to see and to face up to the truth of our own lives and begin to live from a different place. The beginning of this chapter, chapter 5, talks about how the only people who cannot recover are those who are unable to see the truth about themselves. While inventory done properly will enable us to begin to do so. That said, if the foundations of 1, 2 and 3 are not firmly in place, this is not likely to happen. And this was the problem with my first time through the steps. While step 1 was pretty much in place, the foundation, steps 2 and 3, they were definitely not. The cornerstone and the keystone were at best wobbly. And it's interesting to note that the information on that first step 4, what I wrote, was pretty much the same as in my second one. Maybe there was more on my second one because there was more people I was resentful at, I suppose. Yet the first one had no power, had no real impact on me. Why? Because I could not swallow and digest the truth that was revealed. The truth that was revealed the second time through, when I'd truly taken 2 and 3, but I covered my struggles with that last time. So in taking inventory, what are we doing? Well, we are looking for the common manifestations of self, the ways in which it plays out in our lives. It states that resentment is the number 1 offender, meaning that the most common way that selfishness and self-centeredness plays out in our lives is through resentment. Resentments are deadly because if you are lost in them, it's a sure sign that you are locked in self, that you are playing God in the world. If you cannot form a relationship with the power that is needed here, the insanity will return and relapse is likely. Here's what they say on page 64. We did exactly the same thing with our lives. We took stock honestly. First, we searched out the flaws in our makeup which caused our failure. Being convinced that self manifested in various ways was what had defeated us, we considered its common manifestations. Resentment is the number 1 offender. It destroys more alcoholics than anything else. From it stem all forms of spiritual disease, for we have been not only mentally and physically ill, we have been spiritually sick. When the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. In dealing with resentments, we set them on paper. We listed people, institutions, or principles with whom we were angry. Now, the inventory is a column exercise. Whether this is 3 column, 4 column, 5 column, 6 column, or whatever number, I'm not getting into that argument here. People interpret this in slightly different ways. What is key is that you list the people, the institutions, and the principles that you are harboring anger towards, that you go right back to the beginning of your lives. People are pretty obvious, aren't they? An institution perhaps less so. Examples would be organisations like a church or a government, or say the police or school, etc. A principle is more an idea, I suppose, say like a religious belief, or racism, or capitalism, or socialism. But you just list them one by one. I hope you get the idea. And please go column by column by column, or you are likely to get stuck in the resentment. We then ask why we have the resentment. Just a few brief notes so we can go into detail when we share. There will often be more than one resentment towards some people, so please list each resentment in the second column separately. Then we ask how we are affected. They list examples on page 65 in the book. I'll just find that image for you, actually. Sorry, what we said. Here we go. Here's the list of examples here. The first 3 columns there, 1, 2, 3. Page 65. Examples like self-esteem, how I feel about myself; pride, how I think the world sees me; pocketbook, financial matters, that's what pocketbook means, like your wallet, etc. in England; ambition. This is quite a broad term, but it's just someone or something getting in the way of someone or something that I want to do, or someone getting in the way of someone that matters to me wanting to do something. I think ambition comes up pretty much, it certainly does with me and most people I work with. Ambition is everywhere because somebody's always thwarting something, or we imagine that they are. It seems to affect everything, ambition. Personal relationships, including sexual relationships, or of course our relationships with other people, whether they're being hurt or they're being threatened. Our security, whether our security in any sense is being hurt or threatened, that's pretty all-encompassing too. And of course we look for fear, and fear is everywhere. Ruled by self-centered fear. Certainly my life was, although maybe I wouldn't have had the language to say that at the time. So when the first 3 columns are complete, pause and reflect. It will reveal how much of our lives have been torn apart by resentment, and how deadly this the most common manifestation of self actually is. Deadly. They remind us that it potentially could kill us, may well kill us, here on page 66. It is plain that a life which includes deep resentment leads only to futility and unhappiness. To the precise extent that we permit these, do we squander the hours that might have been worthwhile. But with the alcoholic, whose hope is the maintenance and growth of his spiritual experience, the business of resentment is infinitely grave. We found that it is fatal, for when harbouring such feelings, we shut ourselves off from the sunlight of the spirit, the insanity of alcohol returns, and we drink again. And with us, to drink is to die. Fatal. Potentially fatal. Resentment is deadly. It nearly killed me at the end of my first year of physical sobriety. It was far worse then than when I was actually drinking, as it just whirled around me, all consumed my whole being. All I could see was what I perceived the world had done to me, or the people I cared about. I was an utter victim and a slave to this suffering. I was utterly locked in self. and I needed to see how I was a victim of the delusion that I could wrest satisfaction and happiness from this world by attempting to manage everyone and everything, including my own emotions. I was in utter fear of and I saw danger everywhere in the world, just locked in self-centered fear about everything and everyone. So how do we get free? Or how do we begin at least to get free? Well, we don't immediately actually go to the fourth column or whichever number of columns we're going to do. No, we begin by first of all surveying what we believe has happened to us here on page 66. We turn back to the list, for it held the key to the future. We were prepared to look at it from an entirely different angle. We began to see that the world and its people really dominated us. In that state, the wrongdoing of others, fancied or real, had power to actually kill. So it begins by accepting that these people who have hurt us also live from self, and thus are probably spiritually unwell too, just like we have been. They're no different to us, really. They then suggest that we pray for patience and tolerance, two of the key spiritual principles of recovery, by the way. Oh, by the way, there's so much prayer from now on. Every aspect of inventory and everything, actually, basically, throughout the rest of the program, you will see prayer. It's so easy to make the mistake of thinking that the inventory process is all about filling out columns, even if you think you're doing it right, and just looking at what's there in black and white. It is about that, but it's about much more than that. It's also about prayer, about humbly asking for help, about turning to something more than self. Our attitude, or certainly my attitude, needed to change towards the world. It's not so much that we pray for those that we resent even. I know there's a story in the back of the book that suggests praying for individuals that we have resentment towards. And there's nothing wrong with that in and of itself. But it's important to remember that this story is about someone who is 20 years into his sobriety and has done everything. And apart from one resentment, I think it's towards her mother. And they can't let go of this final resentment. So yeah, that's helpful, but really here we need to be focused on our attitudes changing. So the instruction here is that we need a change in our attitude and our attitude towards the life and the people in our lives. So that's what we pray about. Page 67. We ask God to help us show them the same tolerance, pity and patience that we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. When a person offended, we said to ourselves, "This is a sick man. How can I be helpful to him? God, save me from being angry. Thy will be done." Then we turn to the final column. I'm just going to read the instructions here because they say it as well as anything. Page 67. Referring to our list again, putting out of our minds the wrongs others had done, we resolutely looked for our own mistakes. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened? Though a situation had not been entirely our fault, we tried to disregard the other person involved entirely. Where were we to blame? The inventory was ours, not the other man's. When we saw our faults, we listed them. We placed them before us in black and white. We admitted our wrongs honestly and were willing to set these matters straight. This is the key to seeing the truth. Much can be revealed in writing, but the truth is that it really comes when we share it in step 5, actually. It's often said that here also there's a mistake made here, actually, in when we're looking at this final part, where we look for our part in this. And there's a danger in this kind of language, in this way of thinking and acting. The problem with looking for our part is that we will continue to look at their part, something we've probably done all our lives, and it's not going to help us here. If we want to be free, the key is to see our mistakes, how self plays out in our lives. Even with those who have caused us a great deal of harm, we need to see where exactly, precisely, we've been wrong. And from here, of course, we will be able to begin to create a step 8 list. This is not to punish anyone, but to see how we can begin to be set free. And it's amazing when you share it with someone else in step 5, the patterns that really develop here. They may develop when you're writing it, but often I think it's in the sharing. I saw the truth. I had never been honest with a single person in my life. No one saw the real me. Can you see the real me? Can you? I was ruled by fear that folk would see the truth as I saw it about myself. I lived in this state of fear of being hurt by folk. Yes, I grew up in a frightening and confusing environment, but I continued to live in that state throughout my life. The people I hated for hurting the ones I loved were actually no different to me. In reality, I hurt some of those same people, perhaps even more. I fled from, not in the same way, maybe not as directly, but I hurt them. I rejected their love. I fled from reality the whole of my life. I fled from responsibility. I blamed others. I stood in judgment, and I was a victim of life. I was miserably unhappy. My life was devoid of meaning. Every single person I ever knew in my life, even the ones I loved dearly, were on my step 4 list, resentment list. Do you know why? Well, because in truth, even if I had got everything I ever wanted in the way I wanted it, I would still have felt dissatisfied. I would have still been unhappy because deep down inside, I felt nothing. Life meant nothing. It's not how I started out, but it is where I ended up when I found recovery. It's interesting. Every inventory I've ever heard is pretty much the same when you get to the end. I've heard over 70 people now, and I think I've heard everything. Now, please don't get me wrong. This is not about excusing horrific behaviour on the part of other people. It's not about that at all. And the truth is, sometimes the only mistake we make in some situations is that we fail to acknowledge that those people are sick too. Sometimes that's the only mistake. Important to remember that. But I've not been a saint either. I've hurt people, maybe not in the same way, but when I saw the truth, I had to see that, I had to acknowledge that fact. I lived from self-centered fear my whole life. Everything stemmed from this, and thus I attempted to manage everyone and everything. And I did it in a pretty specific way. What I perceived their anger might be, what their threat to me might be. Still have to watch for that now. Some folk call that people pleasing. I don't call it that anymore. I call that purely Danny pleasing, because it was all about my perceived need to protect myself. Yes, I lived in fear from a young age. Yes, it was real when I was young, but I was still living there into my adult life. So next we look at fear, and we look at it for a very good reason. It is the second listed common manifestation of self, as they say about fear on page 67. This short word somehow touches about every aspect of our lives. It was an evil and corroding thread. The fabric of our existence was shot through with it. It set in motion trains of circumstances which brought us misfortune we felt we didn't deserve. But did not we ourselves set the ball rolling? So we ask why we have fear and the ways we have failed to overcome that fear through attempting to manage life. And the problem is, of course, that we attempt to overcome fear with our finite will, our willpower, our finite power. It works to a degree and perhaps for some time, but it's not entirely dependable. The alcoholic needs something that can be absolutely relied upon, that is not finite, that can't be broken and destroyed in this life. I love the direction followed by the promise here on page 68. We trust infinite God rather than our finite selves. We are in the world to play the role He assigns. Just to the extent that we do as we think He would have us and humbly rely on Him, does He enable us to match calamity with serenity. Here we see this theme that is there, that pervades the book, the concepts of this different life. And it's not, I'm not trying to try and kid you. It's not that you will never experience fear in any form at all. Actually, some fear is a quite natural response to circumstances. That animal heart that we humans have. We need the fright instinct. It's vital actually to existence. But there is fear that's unnatural, self-created, and this fear is unhealthy. But the feeling of fear is not the problem. The problem is actually the power of fear. And what's required to overcome the power of fear is courage. And the word courage comes from the French word cœur, C-O-U-R, meaning heart, love, I suppose. And love casts out all fear. So the key is to pray for the courage to overcome the fear, to begin to live through faith. Follow the prayer with appropriate action to live faithfully. And this, I noticed in my recovery, began really in step 9, as I prayed for the courage and found the strength to do what's required to face up to what I needed to face, up to what I needed to clear from my past, to begin to be set free from fear about everyone and everything. The step 9 promises are so much connected to that. You'll hear those later. But as they state on page 66, the verdict of the ages is that faith means courage. All men of faith have courage. They trust their God. We never apologize for God. Instead, we let Him demonstrate through us what He can do. We ask Him to remove our fear and direct our attention to what He would have us be. At once, we commence to outgrow fear. And here we have a beautiful prayer. It's helped me for years. I ask for the fear to be removed and that I be focused on what I need to be. Not even what I need to do, because that's not always certain actually, but what God would have me be in any given situation. We might not know what to do necessarily in any given situation, but we can know how we should be, which is to be thoughtful, considerate, patient, tolerant, loving, kind, etc. We can always know how to be. And I love the promise. At once we commence to outgrow fear. It doesn't suggest that, hey presto, the fear is gone. No, but by living in and through courage, we begin to outgrow fear. The fear has less power because we are living in and by and through faith. It is the power of fear that was always the problem for me. It had power over me, but it doesn't have power over me any longer. So long as I live by faith and courage, I have hope. I have true hope. So now about sex. Let's talk about sex, baby. Now this really isn't about the ins and the outs, I promise you. It's not about the act of sex. Well, not purely about that. It's really about our relationships with others, how we are inspired, I suppose, by this most powerful of human instincts, sex. What is great is that there's no moralizing here. They don't tell us what is right and what is wrong for us as individual people. No, what they give us are tools to explore our relationships with others, to look for specific things in the hope of seeing how we ought to act in the future, how we ought to be in the future with other people. Page 69. We reviewed our own conduct over the years past. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, or considerate? Whom had we hurt? Did we unjustifiably arouse jealousy, suspicion, or bitterness? Where were we at fault? What should we have done instead? We got this all down on paper and looked at it. The key is to shape a sane and sound ideal for the future. An ideal that is not selfish, dishonest, or inconsiderate. A point of interest here on what it means to be selfish, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. This is not a selfish program in any sense, way, shape, or form. But to be selfish means to act without any thought or consideration of others. And one of the key spiritual principles of recovery is consideration for others. And how do we do that? How do we develop that, really? Well, more prayer is suggested as well as the written inventory, as I stated earlier. There's prayer here in the sex inventory. We ask God to mould our ideals and to help us to live up to them. We remembered always that our sex powers were God-given and therefore good, neither to be used lightly or selfishly, nor to be despised or loathed. Some people do. As I said earlier, I was never honest with anyone in any relationship, of any level, not sexual or non-sexual. No one got the real me. I kept myself deeply, deeply hidden. As the song goes, you know your problem, you keep it all in. I was terrified that anyone who knew the real me, that they would reject me, for I believed that there was something fundamentally wrong with me at the core of my human being. So no one had any chance, really. And if anyone dared to fall in love, well, they had to go, for I instantly lost respect for them. I carried deep shame and would go from one extreme to the other, from the hedonism of my late teens and early 20s to near celibacy in my later 20s. I was pretty messed up about this stuff. If relationships ended, I would be so deeply wounded. Why? Because I took everything, so personally. When they say that an alcoholic is sensitive, what I believe it means is that an alcoholic takes everything deeply personally. I certainly took everything deeply personally. So self-centered, really. So lost in self. I had some pretty messed up ideas about masculinity too. I am the son of a gay man, and as I've learned through much work and contact with other similar sons, it's not uncommon when your own father grows up with shame about this kind of stuff, that you will too. It's interesting, I spent the last few years before recovery looking into all this stuff, falsely believing that this was one of the root causes of my trouble. It isn't, but it's the story I told myself, along with many others, by the way, that caused me to be what I was. I'm not, who knows? Now, the point of the work that we do around sex is to form a future ideal. There's no expectation of perfection here, and I've certainly not reached my ideal, but you start with one and you try to live towards it. We aim high and expect to fall short, I suppose. More is constantly revealed. I promise you, it's constantly being revealed to me. Now, after looking at sex, what I also do is look specifically at other harms potentially caused. Many say that we don't need to do this, and as it's covered in the final column in resentment. And that's true to a degree. And if you then list other kind of harms caused, if you don't do a specific harms inventory, but then do a separate list when you do step 8, looking specifically at harms that are not covered through resentment, fear, and sex, then that's okay. As long as, because there are some harms that aren't covered through that, like financial stuff, I suppose. That's an example. But I've just found that by exploring general harms, following the principles in the sixth inventory, I found that helpful, even though it is to a large degree repetitive. You're not likely to learn an awful lot more. It just helps when compiling the step 8 list. And it also guards against folks finding ways to keep certain things to themselves, which really they ought not to. Dangerous for them. So I now look a little at step 5. And they tell us the whole point of this action part of the program in the opening paragraph to chapter 6, Into Action, on page 72. Having made our personal inventory, what shall we do about it? We have been trying to get a new attitude, a new relationship with our Creator, and to discover the obstacles in our path. You know what? This is what recovery is all about. This idea of accessing the power. We are seeking a new attitude towards life, a new relationship with the power, and to discover what is blocking us from the power. The ways that we attempt to manage life by relying on self. They're very careful in suggesting who we should share this inventory with. Well, actually sharing anything with and going forward beyond inventory. They say the person needs to be closed-mouthed, i.e. be able to keep a confidence, not to be affected personally by what you share, and that someone understands what they're talking about. This is why the ideal person is someone who themselves has recovered through this way of life. What we call a sponsor. I know the word sponsor is not in the book, but they use similar language. But by the way, it's okay to share it with more than one person. I have shared inventory with more than one person, even in group. It's up to you. At least one person, as long as they follow that criteria. Closed mouth, understanding, and not be affected personally. That's really key, actually. There's some things you should not share with some people. Page 74. We have no right to save our own skin at another person's expense. Such parts of our story we tell to someone who will understand yet be unaffected. The rule is that we must be hard on ourselves, but always considerate of others. I said earlier, didn't I? Consideration of others is one of the key principles of recovery. They say there are no rules in recovery. Some people say there are no rules in recovery. Well, here's a rule. We must always be considerate of others. You know, if you want to work on anything in recovery, work on this, on being considerate. It is a vital key. Vital from the Latin vitale, meaning life-giving, i.e. you can't live without it. So if you're going to work on something, develop consideration for other people. Now, some might suggest that the current situation we're living in makes it difficult to share. Well, I don't find that to be true at all. You can share an inventory through Zoom quite easily. I've listened to about 10 step 5s in the last year. 9 of them were through Zoom and 1 was done in person, socially distanced. But that was when the weather was warmer. You know, from the beginning of AA history, we've been flexible. There really is no reason at all why a person cannot find another appropriate person, even at this time. Although folks can find plenty of excuses, can't they? Easily done. I know I might have done. Step 5 is incredibly powerful, especially if you hold nothing back. If you speak your truth in love, and if you listen to the person that you are sharing with, it will help you see new insights that perhaps you're still blind to. My second time when I was truly open to the whole of this was one of the most powerful experiences of my life. The promises of this step were realized as I was sharing it and as I did as I shared it again, actually, personally, with a member of clergy a few days later. It's a decision I decided to make, which is kind of strange considering where I'd been only a few weeks before when I was having none of that. But I was just blown open by this stuff. Just blew me apart. The truth was revealed powerfully. How blind I'd been, how deluded I had been. I was a victim of the delusion that I could wrest satisfaction and happiness from this world if I only managed well. But I'm gonna share the instruction and the promise you get from following the instruction here. It's so beautifully put on page 75. We pocket our pride and go to it, illuminating every twist of character, every dark cranny of the past. Once we have taken this step withholding nothing, we are delighted. We can look the world in the eye. We can be alone at perfect peace and ease. Our fears fall from us. We begin to feel the nearness of our Creator. We may have had certain spiritual beliefs, but now we begin to have a spiritual experience. The feeling that the drink problem has disappeared will often come strongly. We feel we are on the broad highway, walking hand in hand with the spirit of the universe. Broad highway is language that's constantly used in this book. They never use phrases like narrow paths. They talk about a broad, open, accepting, welcoming highway. That's the nature of the God that this book speaks of. But after I shared that step 5, I left and went home. Well, actually, I didn't go directly home. I had to go to a friend's party, which was a weird experience in the state of mind I was in. I went for a couple of hours, but I had to go home. And then I followed the further instructions here at the bottom of the page. I didn't build a shelf literally to put my book on, but I took my hour as I was suggested. I took time in prayer. I went over what had gone before. There was nothing missing from those first 5 proposals, the first 5 steps. The structure was solidly in place, unlike when I'd first done this. And as I lay there on my bed during that hour, something happened. Really, those promises of the 5th step began to be realized fully here. I felt a sense of peace. Peace came over me. I did not feel completely alone for the very first time in my whole life. I did not feel terrified of everything and everyone. I had this sense of peace and belonging. And my mind came to rest for the very first time in my life. In fact, it was quite strange what happened, because it was almost like a tiny, audible little pop was kind of heard in my being, if you like. A stillness descended. I slept probably for the first time since I was a little lad without any aid that night. I had suffered insomnia all my life. My mind came to rest, and it's never really sped up since. I have suffered from wrong thinking since that day, but I've never suffered from a racing brain since late in the year in 2004 when this happened. That's a miracle to me, but it's also a fact of my experience. But I do know it can and will return if I somehow become blocked off from that power again by self. But I've not done so since. I probably only suffer from insomnia a couple of times a year now. This is usually because I'm processing something deep inside. Either intense grief, it will happen maybe for a night with that, or if I've got something real guilt or something that I'm really, struggling with, perhaps. But I've not been plagued with insomnia since I was a little child. I've had a little actually this weekend, but that's because I've hurt my shoulder and I've been in pain and I've not been able to sleep properly. It's just starting to heal now. I slept really well last night, but that was a physical issue that was keeping me awake. not my mind, not my spirit, not my soul. It's a physical problem. So after taking that hour, I went to sleep and I slept like I have never slept. I woke up the next day and I was ready. Now, overnight, a couple of other resentments had come back to me, and over the years, many more have actually. And I do what I did then. I wrote them down again and I shared them. And then we took a look at step 6 and 7. Kind of looked at them together. Now, depending on what has occurred really in the first 5 steps, step 6 may be a point to pause actually. It really depends on whether a person is willing and ready to have all that they have discovered removed, whether we can face up to the truth. If we are ready and willing, then we move forward. I asked folk here to put into their own words, a couple of paragraphs really, what they've learned from the step 4 and 5 process. I also asked them to list specifically defects of character, how it manifests specifically in their lives, to write a sex ideal, to have an idea, at least a conception of that starting point, an idea of how they ought to be in life. I also will probably ask them to begin compiling a step 8 thing here as well. And ask them to do that before we met next time, by the way. Just saves work, really. And they ought to do it. It's no point me telling them. We will discuss it and maybe adjust it somewhat, but it's better to do it yourself. Now, I was certainly ready, but I know some folk aren't. And if you are not ready, willing, or able, then the suggestion here is to pray until you are. So we could stop here and we could pray together, or the person could go away and pray until they are ready. They may never be ready, by the way. I don't know when that will be. But if you are ready to let God remove from you all that is blocking you from the power, then we get to it. And that's what I did. Immediately. Don't pause, just do it. And the step 7 prayer is such a powerful tool when it's fully understood. It's a commitment, It's a commitment based on the proof that our way does not work. And we saw the proof in 4 and 5, didn't we? And 6. That's just not working how we try and manage life. So we're going to commit to living a different way. This is the prayer, and it's so beautiful. When ready, we say something like this. So you can change the wording if you as long as you keep with the principles, much like in step 3. So we say something like this. My Creator, I am now willing that you should have all of me, good and bad. I pray that you now remove from me every single defect of character which stands in the way of my usefulness to you and my fellows. Grant me strength as I go out from here to do your bidding. Amen. And there is the Amen, by the way, that's not present at the beginning of this process, step 3, when we make the decision. Here, we make the commitment to give ourselves wholly to God, good and bad. So often the mistake is that we're only giving what's bad. No, it's a commitment to give our whole being. We are committing our whole selves and not just handing over defects, as people say, or shortcomings, or whatever they call them. They're the same thing. Or wrongs, or to use religious language, sins, which basically is a shortcoming because it means from sinari, an archery term, which meant to fall short. Isn't that a shortcoming or a defect? I know some folk, and I'm sure there's been books written and there's people made a lot of money out of this, but some folks tell us that somehow a shortcoming and a defect are different somehow. Simply is not true, In fact, if you look at the steps on the wall, the 12 statements, step 7 talks about our shortcomings there, and yet in the prayer, it talks about defects of character again. So there's your proof if you ever need it. Just the words that mean the same thing, just used interchangeably. And finally, what we're asking for we're asking for the things to be removed that block us from our usefulness to God and the people around us. This is the commitment we're making here. This is the commitment. Work on this, on being useful. Sometimes people work on their defects of character. We need to watch for them, and that's in step 10. But if you work on a defect of character, it's going to get worse. Work on the solution, live in the solution. And if I'm not in self, the defects of character are not manifesting in my life. Because what can happen is they can transform into something else if we try and manage in different ways. So what we do is we make the commitment to live this different way. The whole program is about turning from a self-serving life to a life serving God and the people around us. Here is the promise and the purpose of recovery later in the book. We have recovered and been given the power to help others. We have recovered and been given the power to help others. This is the whole promise and the whole purpose of recovery, actually. And as a result, you never want to take a drink or a drug again. Never enters your mind. This is anything but a selfish program. If you think it is, you either do not understand what it means to be selfish, which is essentially the spiritual malady, without any thought or consideration, acting in such a way without any thought or consideration of others. If you think it is, you either do not understand what is meant by selfishness, which is essentially the spiritual malady, or you have misunderstood what it's all about. To be selfish is to live without any thought or consideration for others, which is the exact opposite of these spiritual principles. Really worth repeating that. That idea is really key to everything. Please don't call this a spiritual, the selfish program. It's anything but. It's about developing consideration, which is the opposite of selfishness. That's the whole point of this. To be selfish is to live without any thought or consideration for others. If you're going to work on anything in your life, work on developing consideration for others. It's the key to everything, the key to these spiritual principles. Okay. I know I went on a bit there, but it's really important, that point. Now we'll look at amends, steps 8 and 9. The step 8 list comes, of course, from the inventory process. If you haven't done a harms list, then you will have to add things here if you're going to do this thoroughly. Stuff that didn't come up in resentment, fear, and sex inventory, such as financial amends, for example. They may not have been covered there, but I'm sure that, well, when we read the stuff on step 9, it covers financial stuff a lot, so you need to do it. Let's not hide anything here. Now, step 9 is where everything begins to change. Here, we begin to go back into the world. Here, we begin to live in reality. The first 8 steps have been done with a sponsor, essentially, haven't they? Just the two of you together in a room. But amends is where change really happens as we begin to go out in the world fully once again. This is the step where the sphincter, if you like, really begins to twitch. This is the one I believe that sorts the men from the boys. I don't agree with the 12 and 12. I mean, yeah, 6 and 7 kind of is to a degree, but I think it's step 9 when we go out to the world and face the world truly as we are. It certainly was for me, and there was so much fear here for me. Here's what they say on page 77. Now we go out to our fellows and repair the damage done in the past. We attempt to sweep away the debris which has accumulated out of our effort to live on self-will and run the show ourselves. If we haven't the will to do this, we ask until it comes. Remember, it was agreed at the beginning we would go to any lengths for victory over alcohol. The idea of going to any lengths, of not shrinking, if you like, is repeated several times here. In fact, the only reason that amends ought not to be made is if it would harm anyone. We've really got to go out there and get on with it. Of course, what we do needs to be discussed with someone who understands but won't be affected. Keep, your sponsor essentially. Sometimes amends can't be made fully, but they can be made partially where possible. We must always be considerate of other people here so we don't cause any further harm. So some amends, if it causes harm, can't be done fully, but perhaps we can find ways to do something. Some amends can't be done at all, so we find alternatives to that. My father had died many, many years earlier. So I found ways to do something. I found ways to put right, to heal what was wrong, to bring freedom to a healing world, to repair the damage done. And prayer, gosh, prayer is so vital. It gives you the strength to overcome the fear. Certainly, it gave me the strength because there was intense fear in some of this step 9. I needed to watch for that fear, and I needed to find the strength and courage to overcome that fear, which is why, of course, we do steps 10 and 11 while we're doing step 9, as we clean up the past, as it says in stuff on step 10. We don't wait until we've finished. Goodness me, I wouldn't send someone out to do that. You need step 10 and 11 just to keep you going, really, to watch for that stuff. And resentment and fear is going to be coming up all the time until you've cleared it up. And you need to find the strength and courage to overcome the fear. Here's what they say on page 79. Although these reparations take innumerable forms, there are some general principles which we find guiding. Reminding ourselves that we have decided to go to any lengths to find a spiritual experience, we ask that we be given strength and direction to do the right thing, no matter what the personal consequences may be. We may lose our position or reputation or face jail, but we are willing, we have to be, we must not shrink at anything. It's about clearing our side of the street, the mess that has come from trying to manage life from the spiritual malady, living from that malady. Hopefully, we have understood where we have been at fault, our mistakes, even from those who have caused a great deal of harm. And we mustn't go and point out where they're at fault. Of course we must not. And that's often the hardest when they're folk who have caused far more harm than we have. The ones who have hurt the ones that we love. And they're the ones that cause the greatest fear, I find. But they're also the ones that set us free. And that's why in that inventory process, in the resentment aspect, we don't look for our part. Because if we look for our part, we're still going to look at their part. We look for our mistakes where we have been at fault. We disregard them entirely here, not excusing anybody, but we're here to clear our side of the street, not theirs. Now, I could share so many wonderful, powerful examples here, but we'd be sat here for another couple of hours. So I'm just going to share actually possibly the hardest one, certainly the one that gave me the greatest fear, the most terrifying, the one that I shook with fear on the way to doing actually, the one that caused my fear all my life. So I've been doing lots of other amends with family and friends and other stuff too, but there was one really big one I needed to do. I'd reconnected with great parts of my family, my dad's family, and it'd been wonderful and it just cleared up so much, but there was one that I really needed to do. It's the one that caused the greatest fear. So I asked my half-sister Natalie to help me. I asked me if she'd contact her dad, Dave, if she'd contact him for me and ask if I could meet him. This was a man I was utterly terrified of, who had felt ruled by in terror, really. As a child, I lived in terror. I would shake. Even as an adult male, shake by his presence would cause such fear in me. terrified, and I had violent fantasies about being a tiny little boy, was because I was so terrified of him. But that day I was sat in her living room and I saw his van pull up. I stood up and I watched him walk down the path. Well, actually, he hobbled down the path. He was actually in quite a bad state physically. He was an old man at this point. And you know what happened? As he walked down the pathway towards the house, I felt the hate, I felt the fear, I felt the anger, I felt the terror, I felt the pain, I felt the shame leave me right there and then. Before I even spoke to the man, it left me. I met him at the door. I shook his hand, greeted him, and we talked together. I looked him in the eye and I made my amends. And then we spent most of the rest of the next time, and it probably lasted quite some time. I spent most of the rest of the time listening to him as he spoke of many things, including a brother who had died of alcoholism. As I looked at this man, what I saw was a man who was and is, it's no longer with us actually, spiritually sick. A lost man, a man in a lot of pain, a man filled with a lot of regret, so much regret. I felt love for him. In the real sense of the word love, I felt a connection on a really deep human level. In that space that opened up between us, God brought healing. I felt it deeply. I was deeply conscious of it. I felt it, and I believe that he did too. I left my sister's house that day, and I just seemed to float through the next few weeks as I continued reconnecting to life. Something that's continued in the months and the years, decades now, I suppose, almost 2 decades, getting that way anyway, that have gone on since. I could feel that not only was I accessing the power, but I was actually beginning to live by the power. I was beginning to transcend the spiritual malady. Recovery was coming. I was recovering from this condition. I wouldn't say I'd recovered at this point, but I was on my way. By the way, to be recovering from something one day, it means you have to be recovered. Of course it does. Otherwise, you're not actually recovering. You're in some other kind of state. A few years later, I conducted the funeral of his son, our brother Alan. He was the one whose wedding I'd had my first drunk at, actually, that I shared about in the first video. I was able to hold the whole family through this. And last summer, I conducted Dave's funeral too. And to a degree, while grieving, I relived some of the pain of childhood and other stuff too. That's only natural. That's just natural grief, by the way. If you don't do that, there's something wrong with you. And I was able to hold the family through this. I can't say there were many tears at the funeral, but we came through it together. The tears came after the funeral, actually, as we held one another and loved one another. We came together as a huge family that have been wounded in so many ways, but healing is coming. Healing comes. And I was given the strength to do my job, to play my role fully in life, to carry those that I love so dearly through such a difficult time. Something that surprises some people even today. I was always the weak one, the runt of the family, the stumpik, as Dave used to call me, actually, the weak one. I remember when I conducted our Alan's funeral, his wife, Karen, saying to me that she couldn't believe that I was able to do that today. Because all she remembered was this quiet, frightened little boy that she met when she first came home with our Al. But I'm not that man today, thanks to what this gives me. It gives me the power to overcome anything, to do what I'm here to do. These last few years, I have taken seriously what the purpose of recovery is: to serve God and the people around us. Sobriety is not enough. If you think it is, then it's still all about you, and you're still lost in selfishness and self-centeredness. The spiritual life is not a theory, we have to live it. There is a long period of reconstruction ahead, and we must take the lead. So we clean house with the family, asking each morning in meditation that our Creator show us the way of patience, tolerance, kindliness, and love. Recovery is about rebuilding relationships. There has been a great deal of healing in my wider family and my wider community. It isn't perfect, far from it, but it's a lot better than it was. This continues on, and I know that so many people have benefited from this. Recovery is far more than physical sobriety or being clean of drugs. It's about how we live. It's about bringing healing to a broken and a fractured world. As they say right early on in the book, in chapter 2, there is a solution on page 19. We feel that elimination of our drinking is but a beginning. A much more important demonstration of our principles lies before us in our respective homes, occupations, and affairs. If it's still only about you being sober today, then it's still all about you. Sobriety is almost a byproduct of the life, if you like. You get it from living a different life. But I'll talk more about that when exploring the last aspect in the final video. When I look at 10, 11, and 12, and I look at the final part of step 12, as well as the carrying the message part and the spiritual awakening, practicing these principles in all our affairs. There's some good stuff, particularly in the family afterwards, about that actually. But that's next time. Now, step 9 ends with what are called the promises. They are, of course, the promises of cleaning up the past and bringing healing in the world in which we live and breathe and share our being. There are many promises in this book. Some say there's as much as 200. I don't know. There's a lot. But so what we call the promises of step 9. So when it talks about halfway through, it means halfway through the amends process. Really important, not halfway through the steps or whatever else. It's halfway through that. So these are directly related to clearing up the wreckage of our past. It's always important to listen to them in that context. Here's what it says anyway on pages 83 and 84. If we are painstaking about this phase of our development, we will be amazed before we are halfway through. We are going to know a new freedom and a new happiness. We will not regret the past, nor wish to shut the door on it. We will comprehend the word serenity, and we will know peace. No matter how far down the scale that we have gone, we will see how our experience can benefit others. That feeling of uselessness and self-pity will disappear. We will lose interest in selfish things and gain interest in our fellows. Self-seeking will slip away. Our whole attitude and outlook upon life will change. Fear of people and of economic insecurity will leave us. We will intuitively know how to handle situations which used to baffle us. We will suddenly realize that God is doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. Are these extravagant promises? We think not. They are being fulfilled among us, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. They will always materialize if we work for them. If we work for them. Now, these promises are a part of my being. I probably first fully realized them in the spring of 2005 at another brother's wedding. when I could see whilst in the midst of my world that I was different, that everything was different. I was able to enjoy, to celebrate this wonderful occasion. And more than that, I was able to be there for others when something awful did happen, actually, at the end, without getting caught up in the madness of others. I was able to be there for people, the people that I love, in the right way. I intuitively knew how to handle a situation that in the past would have utterly baffled me. In fact, I would have probably fled from. But no, I was able to be there without getting caught up in the madness of others. That night I put my day to bed, and then I put myself to bed, and I slept peacefully and wholeheartedly. And those experiences have continued to grow ever since. Those promises become even more realized as time goes by. Again and again and again, these last few months, a deeper experience of that has been realized as I came particularly through the grief around Dave last summer. So I hope that helps. That's it now. That's all, folks, on accessing the power, essentially steps 4 through to 9. Next time, the next video, I will be exploring how we live with the power. Essentially 10, 11, and 12. Got an hour for that too. But that's enough for now. So until we meet again, may God bless us all. Keep on rocking in the free world, all you groovers and you shakers out there. Stay free. It's how we're meant to be, you know.